and we will see them in action. A little bit about myself. My name is Javier Villegas. I am from Argentina. I work at Mediterranean Shipping Company as IT director in the DBA and BI services area. I am a Microsoft MVP in the data platform category since 2016, and I am also Microsoft certified trainer. Additionally, I'm also a member of the Azure Data Community Advisory Council since last year, and I'm also a technical speaker who would like to go to as many events as I get invited to present about data platform topics. I'm also one of the organizers of our local community here in Buenos Aires, Sql Argentina. We have our meetup, we have our monthly events, now slowly coming back to in-person event, hopefully. So for the ones who would like to join us, you are more than welcome. The disclaimer is that this is mainly in Spanish, but again, you're free you're very welcome to join us. On the left side of the screen, you have my contact information. If you have any question regarding to this presentation, or if you just want to, have something to discuss, I'm really happy to connect with all of you. So let's move on and start talking about SQL Server 2022. Basically, it was presented last year during Ignite, right? And Microsoft called it this the new hybrid data services, right? When it said that it was presented, means that they announced it, right? But they, let's say, release it as private preview for reduced number of customers and community members, right? This concept of private preview means that we are getting involved in the early release just to start getting in touch with the features and also providing feedback to Microsoft to basically, if we found a problem running our own workload in this new version, right, we just provide this feedback, and Microsoft will be releasing features every so often addressing those problems and also releasing additional features, right? A couple of months ago, during Microsoft Build, another big event, right? Microsoft released this as public preview, right? That means that it's no longer for a reduced set of customers, but now everybody can go to the Microsoft site and download the public preview, right? And again, do exactly the same. Test in advance, try our own workload and see how it gets in action, and we get prepared for when it gets released later this year, right? So it was released 2-3 months ago as what Microsoft called Community Technical Preview, the public version, right? And every 1.5 months, 2 months, they released a new CTP version for us to try. So if you would like to give it a try, then later on, I will provide all the necessary links for you to start going and getting involved with this version, downloading, installing, etc. Right? So let's see what we can have with SQL Server 2022. Right? First of all, this is not something new coming out of nowhere. Right? This is an evolution of what Microsoft called the modern versions of SQL Server, which is starting SQL Server 2016, right? There are a set of features that are evolving since then, and also, of course, new features that will address specific challenges that we may find every single day with our applications, our databases, right? So we can say that SQL Server is a quite mature product, right? It's been in the market for more than 30 years, and definitely now today we really see this kind of enhancements that will help us to achieve really great things, right? You saw in the first slide that I was mentioning the hybrid data service, right? So we will try to go to this concept of hybrid. What does it mean, and how we can take advantage of, right? We know that SQL Server is the product that we download and we can install either in our on-premise environment, our bare metal servers, our virtual machines, our laptops for development, and also we can install it in any cloud provider, right? We're going to be focusing, of course, in Azure virtual machines, right? In where we can also have SQL Server 2022. So, which are, let's say, the group or the categories of features and enhancements that we will see with this new version? First of all, we're gonna talk about what is this concept of business continuity through Azure, right? And we will cover some of the features that basically will allow us to achieve business continuity, high availability, involving and merging, let's say, the on-premise world with some of the Azure data services. Then, regarding to the data warehouse features, right? We will see how we can have some sort of real-time synchronization between our operational data and our warehouse in Azure Synapse Analytics. Then in terms of governance, right, we will see how we can integrate Microsoft Pureview, the data catalog offering from Microsoft in the cloud, right, with this new SQL Server 2022. Also, we can have, for the very first time, all the power of cryptography, blockchain within SQL Server, and we will have a quick view of this new feature called SQL Server Ledger, right? And then we will focus in the enhancements in the performance area, right? This is something that Microsoft, with every single version, is investing a lot. And as I like to say, not only to run our workload much faster and much more efficient, but also to try to make it stable, predictable, right? And addressing this big problem that we all have seen, which is basically the regressions, right? When running certain type of workload, right? So these are the main pillars of SQL Server 2022. We will cover each of them, right, with some hands-on example as well, right? So the capabilities is first of all, that is connected through Azure with managed instance, right? And we will see it in action, Pureview, and Azure Synapse Analytics. This is how Microsoft called this the hybrid data service, because it allows us to deeply integrate SQL Server 2022 with Azure data servers, really seamless, right? In terms of building intelligence, as we said, in terms of performance, what Microsoft is trying to achieve and help us to achieve as well is the possibility of having our own user databases, our own workload in some sort of autopilot mode in terms of performance, right? In where we don't have to do much to make it faster, to make it stable. We will see the enhancements related to security, availability, and scalability with this version. Also, something quite interesting, something that today we see with Azure SQL Database is this concept of data virtualization, in where from SQL Server, we will be able to have access to data that is stored in a modern storage, like, for example, an storage account, right? And finally, and something that we all love to see, is enhancements in the Transact SQL language. With that, we're going to see in action, like we have the opportunity to do faster things, better things, using less amount of code. Because for certain scenarios that today we have to develop our own T-SQL process, now Microsoft is giving us a native function, for example, right? So in terms of connectivity, as I said, connected to managed instance for the high availability option. In terms of Azure Synapse Analytics, to make the data warehouse way better, let's say. In terms of pure view data catalog, to explore our area in terms of what new data we may have in the database. In terms of authentication, this is also something quite interesting. For the very first time, we are also allowed to authenticate through our SQL Server 2022 using Azure Active Directory, right? Quite interesting. And also have the possibility to integrate SQL Server 2022 with Microsoft SQL Defender or Defender for SQL to basically have some sort of process that we constantly monitor for anomalies in terms of, let's say, something wrong in terms of a malicious activity in our databases, and will take certain actions and also notify ourselves. So let's focus on what Microsoft like to say challenges, right? And to solve or to address that challenge, they will present a feature for that, right? So now set up and maintain a disaster recovery site is quite difficult to, do everything. Starting by finding another data center in a remote location, right? Buying the hardware, setting up the network connectivity, setting up the window cluster, the authentication, and everything to, for example, set up always on availability groups, right? It's something that, the features that we have now today in SQL Server are great to accomplish that, but for ourselves to do the setup is quite complex, right? Okay, now, for the very first time with SQL Server 2022, we can combine a SQL Server with managed instance. That means that we will have a distributed availability group in where we can have one or more user databases synchronizing, replicating between the read-write replica, that could be SQL Server 2022, and the read-only replica, that could be the managed instance. And even more interesting is that eventually we can do a failover, meaning we can switch the role. The replica that is the read-write one can be in managed instance, and the read-only can be SQL Server 2022. So with that, eventually, if we need to, let's say, initiate a failover because of a situation that we have in our on-premise environment and use the managed instance as the new primary, we can use it really, really seamless, right? So this is huge because till now, if you want to set up a SQL Server availability group, it has to be with SQL Server, not using managed instance. As for now, we can do it involving a distributed availability group and managed instance. Really, really easy, right? And with that, it also come up an additional, let's say, feature, right? Or feature, let's say, that will also help us to achieve this. Now today, to go to a managed instance, we can take a backup of our user databases, starting from SQL Server 2005 to SQL Server 2019, and quite easily restore those backups to the managed instance, right? but we cannot take a backup of the user databases in managed instance to restore to SQL Server 2022. So the migration, let's say, is one way only. Now, with SQL Server 2022, we can easily take a backup of a database in managed instance and restore it back to SQL Server 2022. That is really, really interesting to see it in action for the very first time. As you can see in the upper right corner, there is something that is saying private preview. That means that in order to test this feature, it's not only that you just go and download the bits from SQL Server 2022 and you do it by yourself. You have to involve Microsoft because, as for now, they have to enable something in terms of configuration on the managed instance that you will be using as a member of the distributed availability group. Okay, the next challenge is that, when we do data warehousing, right, setting up an ETL process, extraction, transformation, and load process is quite complex, difficult to set up, difficult to maintain, and quite easily the data get out of date. That means that when we have this complete, we run the ETL process, but we don't run this constantly. We run it once a day, once a week, once every 6 hours to move the data to our warehouse, right? Okay, now for the very first time with SQL Server 2022 and this feature called Azure Synapse Link for SQL, we will be able to get a specific user database. We can select our tables in SQL Server and have them replicating, right, to a dedicated SQL pool in Synapse Analytics. That means that every single insert, update, delete that we do against our operational tables will be replicated immediately in almost real time to a dedicated SQL pool in Synapse. And with that, we can do analytics with real-time data, right? This is really awesome, and it works really well. And again, eventually, we can replace the ETL processes, right, completely by using this feature, right? So having the data replicated in an Azure Synapse Analytics SQL dedicated pool, we have the data over there, and we can, for example, do Power BI reports with real-time data. Really, really great. So let's see these two features in actions. I will do another disclaimer here for this specific demo, which is that, I said that this is a pre-release version, right? So I did the whole setup with the initial CTP version 2.0, which was the first public version. And a few days ago, Microsoft released a new one, the CTP 2.1, right? Which I installed on my environment, and I mess up the whole demo. But I have the recording of what I did with the initial CTP 2.0, right? And I will play the video and tell you exactly what I'm doing all the way. So let me just cancel the audio and do play. Here I'm connected to a SQL Server 2022 with the new Management Studio 19 preview, right? We go to one of our user databases, and we see that now through the menu, we have this option, Azure SQL Managed Instance Link. And there are two options, replicate database and failover database, right? So what we will do here is we will set up the whole process to have one user database replicated between managed instance and SQL Server 2022. So this wizard will basically do a cross-check, see if we have everything that we need in order to do this setup. on this release is asking for two specific trace flags that we have to set on our SQL Server 2022. So what we will do here, right, in order to continue, we will open Management Studio, a new session, and we will set up these two trace flags as a global trace flag. Specifically, the 195.67 is mainly to compress the data that we are doing to do the replication between the instances, right? So here, the only thing that I do is just set those trace flags, right? 1800 and 95.67 with the -1 to make it for the whole instance, right? Now it's there. I just rerun the checker and all the prerequisites are there. So then we can select one or more user databases to put in our distribute availability group, right? So we select this one. Then we have to sign in into our Azure subscription, right? And with that, when we subscribe, then we continue and we add the managed system, right? So at this point, I will cancel the wizard because I already have this created, right? So you will see that in Management Studio, under Always On High Availability, I have these two. One is an availability group, and the other one is a distribute availability group created by this wizard, in where I have the database, right, connected against my managed instance. So now, right, I have a table in SQL Server 2022 called sample table CSV in the database DemoDB, which is the one that I add into the availability group. When I do the select, you can see here that we have almost 146,000 rows, and the first ID is 5,000, right? Now I go to the managed instance, right? And I have the same table, of course, with the same amount of rows and the same ID, right? If eventually on this database, I would like to delete one row, I'm gonna get an error message that the database is in read-only mode, because again, it's the read-only replica of our distribute availability group, right? So we have our SQL Server 2022, the managed instance, and additionally here, I am connected to a dedicated SQL pool in Azure Synapse Analytics. So here you will see that from my Management Studio, I'm connecting to SQL Server, to the managed instance, and to the Synapse Analytics SQL dedicated pool, right? So now in Synapse Analytics, you will see that we have exactly the same amount of data, almost 146,000 rows, and the first ID is 5,000, right? I go to my SQL Server, which is the primary, and I will delete, right, 1,000 rows, right? So I just go there, it's my primary, so I'm allowed to delete, so I just delete 1,000 rows. When I do the select, again, of course, I have 1,000 row less, and my first ID is 6,000, right? When I go to the managed instance and I do a select to my table, right, you will see that now my first ID is 6,000. So in fact, I delete from the primary and it gets replicated to my managed instance. And as a last step, I do the same in the dedicated SQL pool table in Synapse Analytics, and I have exactly the same data replicated. So within this demo, what I try to do is that show the two new features, right? The distributed availability group with managed instance and the synchronization between SQL Server 2022 and a dedicated SQL pool in Synapse Analytics in real time, right? So this is great because, again, the demo is only deleting data, but eventually if you do an insert of new rows or anything, you will see the changes replicated right away to both managed instance and the dedicated SQL pool. All right. So in terms of security, right? We mentioned that for the very first time, we are going to be able to authenticate against an active Azure Active Directory, right? Not only Windows, let's say, Active Directory, but now also with Azure Active Directory with, the whole MFA, security, etc. So this is really great. Integration with the Azure Pureview, the data catalog, right? And Microsoft Defender for SQL. These are the three main features related to security, right? So the new challenge is that we will need to have a central place to do governance across all our SQL servers, right? So with SQL Server 2022 and Azure Pureview, we can easily configure the environment so Pureview go there and do an insight of our data and come up with the lineage of what we may have. This is not something that will help us to say, hey, you have this table with this column and this data type. No, this is a step above that, which is more to come up with a business entity in where we have the data. So eventually, if we need to present to the rest of the world, which are the kind of data that we are storing in a particular environment, we can have it from there. So this way, if we are starting, for example, a new deployment, a new project, etc., we go to this catalog and we check what we can get in terms of business data from here. Really, really interesting. In terms of performance, well, this is the part that I like the most, actually, which is, again, the possibility of helping us to achieve predictability and, avoid the regressions, right, in our execution. So, as for the rest of the features, this is an evolution of what we got before, right? So in SQL Server 2017, Microsoft introduced for the very first time this concept of adaptive query processing, right? In where for certain scenarios, right, SQL Server was able to provide a feedback after executing a particular statement, right? And for the upcoming execution, make some adjustment based on certain scenarios on the execution plan, so the upcoming execution were more efficient. The best example for this is the memory grant feedbacks, right? You know that when we get a SQL statement, a store procedure, and we run it for the first time, what the SQL engine will do is compile it and store it into the cache, right? And then use that plan within the cache to execute upcoming times, right? That plan in the cache is mainly created based on the first execution. So if our store procedure has certain amount of parameters, the plan going to be created for those parameters, right? So in the example of memory grant feedback, let's say, and this is the same example that I always provide, that when SQL compile the execution plan for the very first time, it will grant 10 megabytes of memory, right, for that execution, right? So the upcoming execution, every time that you run it, SQL Server will be granting for that execution 10 megabytes, right? And let's say that by the end of the execution, you end up using 1 megabyte instead of 10. So you are wasting or not using 9 megabytes. That is not a big deal, right? Because, our server has a lot of memory. But what's going to happen if that specific procedure, which has granted 10 megabytes for the execution, is being executed hundreds of times per minute, right? So we won't be wasting only 9 megabytes. We will be wasting 9 megabytes for each of the concurrent executions that we are at. And what's happening the other scenario in where SQL Server granted 10 megabytes, but because of how we executed, because of the parameters, we ended up using 20 megabytes or requesting 20 megabytes. SQL Server, of course, will execute our query, right, our store procedure, but it will be using the 10 dB, right, to fulfill that memory that requires. Right? So with adaptive query processing, memory grant feedback, what SQL Server is doing is, after executing, providing a feedback to SQL Server saying, hey, I'm not using the right amount of memory. So for the upcoming execution is adjusting, right, the memory granted, so it will be using it the right way, right? So this is how it was introduced back in SQL Server 2017, right? A big enhancement, and being able to provide this feedback was really great. Then there was an evolution of this feature in SQL Server 2019, in where Microsoft kind of rebranded to Intelligent Query Processing, in where they added additional scenarios in where the SQL Server engine was getting way better or smarter in providing this feedback, and also accomplish the objective of avoiding regression. So you will see in the slide here that the ones that are in gray, right, the squares that are in gray, are the ones coming in SQL Server 2019, right? The most popular ones was scalar UDF inlining, right? You know that for SQL Server, historically, when our query had a scalar UDF, right, SQL Server was never doing so great because it was considered that it has no weight, right? But instead, we have developers that get really creative and put a lot of business logic inside of a scalar UDF, right? So SQL Server was not doing really great. In SQL Server 2019, right, we have the possibility that the engine goes to the guts, to the definition of the scalar UDF, right, get the execution plan, and then embed the plan of that function within the main plan. And the execution ended up being way more accurate and better, right? Now, in SQL Server 2022, Microsoft added an additional set of features to Intelligent Query Processing, and they call it Intelligent Query Processing Next Generation, in where now this relies a lot on Query Store. Query Store was this feature introduced back in SQL Server 2016, in where, when we enabled Query Store back then, the engine was capturing all the plans and all the runtime statistics for all the workload in our specific user database. Remember that in 2016, 17, and 19, when we create a new database, Query Store was disabled by default. Now, in SQL Server 2022, when we create a new database, Query Store is enabled by default, same as for Managed Instance and Azure SQL Database. And why is that? Well, because these features that I will mention and will present now will rely a lot on Query Store, right? The features that I would like to mention here are two specifically, and then we're going to cover a third one, right? But we have CE feedback and DOP feedback, right? CE stands for cardinal estimation, and DOP stands for degree of parallelism, right? So what Intelligent Query Processing Next Generation offered to us in this area? Well, basically, you know, when we run a specific query, a store procedure, SQL Server may identify that we may need a specific hint to run it better, or even change the cardinality estimation level to a different one, right? As for now, before 2022, what we need to do is when we identify this situation, we open the specific procedure, right? And for example, we enter the hint manually and we recompile the store procedure, right? With CE feedback in SQL Server 2022, what the engine will do is will detect every single statement running in our user database, right? And if it recommends that we need to run it in a different CE level or with a specific hint using query store, right? It will force that hint for that query ID, right? So we won't have to do anything, right? SQL Server will do it for us and will tune and find all the statements that will run better with a specific hint. We will see it in action in a minute. For DOP is the same degree of parallelism. We all know that setting up the DOP on a SQL Server is a nightmare, right? And depending to who you ask, they're going to come up with a different formula, different scenario, right? Well, now what SQL Server will do is when our statement runs, right? And if it detects that it could run better using a lower DOP, it will set it up for us for that specific query, not for the whole instance or the whole database, just for that specific query and without us doing anything, right? Because it's going to be using query store. Super, super interesting. So, query store, right? Enabled by default, intelligent query processing, next generation, right? These two features, DOP feedback and CE feedback, available using and relying on query store. Then you see at the bottom that in query store we have also read replicas. So for the very first time, there's going to be a different set of query store recommendations, let's say, for the read-only replicas, not only for the read-write, right? So that's going to be really, really interesting. And then there is this feature also mentioned, parameter sensitive plan, PSP optimization, right? This is quite interesting. We will see it in a second. So how do we use all this? First of all, we need to switch to SQL Server 2022, upgrade, right? And then switching to the new compatibility level 160, right? Which is, you know, SQL Server 2022. So this third feature, parameter sensitive plan optimization. Let's imagine this scenario that for sure you all seen it at some point. And this is mainly related to parameter sniffing. When we have a store procedure that we run it for the very first time with one specific parameter, right? SQL Server will come up with the execution plan and we'll store it into the cache, right? Let's say that in order to execute that procedure with that specific parameter, SQL Server required to use a seek, right? So then we run it, right, with a different parameter. And in order to run ideally, right, it's going to require to do a table scan instead of an index seek, right? So what's going to happen? We're going to be ended up using a plan which was created for a different parameter, which is not ideal for the parameter that I'm using right now. So with PSP optimization, what SQL Server will be doing is that when we run for the very first time the procedure, it will compile the plan and it will come up with the with the seek right? Again, when we run it again for the, with a different parameter that requires a different plan, it will come up with the second plan. And for the first time, we will have both plans in the cache, right? So depending on which parameter we use, it's going to be using one plan or the other. Now the question is, what's going to happen if we use another parameter which is not 1 or 10, right? Of course, it's not going to create one plan for each parameter that we use. It's going to be using, a pattern to use one plan or the other based on the parameters. Really, really interesting. So we still have a few minutes. Let's see CE feedback and DOP feedback in action. All right, I'm switching to my SQL Server 2022. Let's see DOP feedback. What I'm doing here basically is restoring my user database. I did it here. I'm also populating it with additional data and creating a simple store procedure, right? The next step will be setting up max degree of parallelism for the whole instance to 0. This is not recommended, but for the sake of the demo, that will help us a lot. So the next step that I will do here, I will create an extended event that will show us what SQL Server is doing with our specific workload in terms of degree of parallelism. So we create this extended event, we start the session, right? And now what we're going to be doing here is enabling query store, just for the sake of the demo, right? Clearing the query store and enabling the DOP feedback and clearing the procedure cache, right? So this is the preparation for the demo. So what I'm going to be doing next is I go to my Management Studio, right? I go to Extended Events. I have my session called DOP Feedback, and let's see it in real time. So for now, we see nothing because there is no activity on our SQL Server. So if I go to my script, I go to DOP feedback. What I have here is something that basically will run a specific query multiple times in parallel, right? This is running, and of course, remember, we set the DOP to 0, right? So what we are using here and what we are doing actually is executing this specific procedure called warehouse get stock item by supplier with the parameter 4. So we run it, and for the very first time, the extended event gave us something. So when we go here and check, it is saying that it is recommending the DOP 8 for this specific execution, right? The original execution time was 52,000, and now with the adjusted DOP is 22, right? So without us doing anything for this specific query, it just adjusted the DOP to 8, right? It is doing what they call the proposal and then the verification. So it's not only just doing it and setting up, it's executing it. And after the execution is verifying that with the new DOP, the CPU, in this case, usage or duration is better, right? And this is not going to end here. Eventually, if there is a better proposal of degrading the DOP to 4, 2, or even one, it will be doing it by itself without us having to do anything. We didn't have to go to the store procedure, open it, and modify it, right? So it is doing it for us. Really, really great, right? So let's close the DOP. Let's close this one too. And then we will go to CE feedback, right? For this one, the preparation is going to be quite similar. We will create also an extended event, right, here. Then what we will do here for the database Adventures Work Extended, we are setting the compatibility level to 160. We are clearing the query store, and we are cleaning the procedure cache, right? So next step will be executing. Let's go also to the extended event. Let's refresh here. And let's see it live. Right. So we have the feedback here. We will run this simple query 15 times. Right. Good. Then we will see why 15. When we go check here, there's still nothing. Right. So then I will run it one more time. Right. I don't know if you noticed, but the execution was a bit faster, right? And the extended event came with something. The CE feedback is saying that if we use this specific hint, right, for that query, it's going to run much better. It is checking us and giving us the recommendation here. So if we run it one more time, right? Again, the execution is getting way faster, right? When we go check our DMVs, we said that for this specific query ID, it has set this specific hint, right? And it is verified, so it will be using it for the upcoming execution, right? In previous versions, we have to manually identify that we may need a hint for this specific query. We need to specify the hint ourselves and then run it. Here, I didn't have to change my code at all, right? SQL Server, using the query store, right, to identify the query and the plan ID is doing it for us, right? Super interesting because, again, it's helping us to put our database in autopilot mode. Great. So, another set of improvement in SQL Server in terms of security. SQL Server Ledger, we will see it in a second, right? Scalability, we will also have the possibility of have this concept of ham-free 10dB, right? For configuring it and for the latches. We all know that to set up the 10dB in terms of numbers of files, sizes, etc., is always complex. Well, Microsoft is trying to get to an approach in where we don't have to worry much about the 10dB because it's going to do it for us. And in terms of availability, this is also a really interesting feature, which is called contained availability group, right? That for the very first time, right, we will be able not only to synchronize user databases in our availability group, we will also be able to synchronize system objects like logins and SQL shells. That means that if we create a login in our primary, right, with a specific password and a specific set of permission, it will be automatically synchronize it with all the read-only replicas. Not as now that we have to manually create that login and maintain those login and also SQL shops in all the replicas. This is really, really great. Okay. The challenge is that I want to use the power of blockchain in a SQL Server 2022. Why I would like to use that? Let's say that, for example, I have a banking application that will require to make sure that the data was not tampered at all, right? Because we have to go through an audit process or something like that. We have to make sure that the database, the data has not been tampered, not even by a user with sysadmin right? So for that, Microsoft has introduced this SQL Server Ledger, right, in where we can create a new type of tables, right, in where, using, let's say, blockchain technology, it will make sure that not even the sysadmin is able to modify the data. So if there is an external entity that comes to our institution to make the audit, we can provide them the proof of truth that the data is not touched, right, and is intact and with no changes, right? So this is super, super nice. So let's see quickly in action. My login is a sysadmin, right? So I can do everything in my SQL Server. So here I'm creating a new database, dropping the schemas and everything to prepare the demo, right? And what I'm doing here is creating this new table called key cards event, right? And see that for my table, I have this option, ledger on append only, right? So I'm creating the table, right? The table, of course, is empty at this point, right? And I will be adding one row here. So I have the row in there. See that there is these two additional columns called ledger start transaction ID and sequence number. So when I go here, I see the audit information, that when was the commit time, but which user and which is the value. Excuse me. Let me take somewhere. So now let's imagine that someone come and say, hey, I want to change this event for this specific employee ID, right? So when I go here and I try to do the update, even with my login, which is sysadmin, right? We got a message saying updates are not allowed for append only ledger table, right? So we cannot modify the table at all. Really, really interesting. Okay, other improvements in terms of the engine, enhancements in the OLTP memory, let's say distributed availability group enhancement, also in terms of monitoring, XML compression, right, which is really, really good now, how it compresses tables with XML data, right, and more granularity in the dynamic data masking option. In terms of data virtualization, right, from SQL Server 2022, we can create external tables and access data that is stored in a Parquet, JSON, or CSV format in an external storage. Enhancements at the SQL level, all these new, options, for example, greatest, least, improvement in or enhancement actually in a string split option, is not distinct from or is distinct from, this is really, really interesting, time series with date bucket, generate series, etc., and also improvement on handling JSON data. So, as a summary, SQL Server is Azure enabled for disaster recovery, analytics, and security, right? Building intelligence to get better performance with no code change, right? Innovation in multiple areas like security, scalability, and availability, data virtualization, and object storage through SQL, and also enhancement in the T-SQL language. To sum up, these are the important links for you to start with getting involved with SQL Server 2022. If you go to aka.ms/SQL Server 2022, you will get into the official documentation. Also, aks.ms/get SQL Server 2022, you will go directly to the landing page to start downloading the bits to start playing with. This is a quote from myself when Microsoft announced the public CTP version, right? I've been using it since the initial private preview and taking a lot of advantage of the intelligent query processing VNext option. Finally, if you would like to get additional information on what's new, SQL Server 2022, here you have the link. Same for Azure SQL Fundamentals. And with that, we complete the presentation. If you have questions, Asan, if there are questions in the chat, or someone would like to ask something, or later on, if someone would like to reach me directly by Twitter, LinkedIn, or email, you are more than welcome.
For a question that is there any configuration required for data synchronization between on-premise SQL Server database with the Synapse SQL pool?
Say again, if it is what?
Is there any configuration required to for data synchronization between SQL Server on-prem database with the Synapse SQL pool?
Yes, actually for both, for the managed instance distributed availability group, and also for the Azure Synapse link feature. For managed instance, mainly the virtual networks in where you have the managed instance and your SQL Server have to have what they call VNet peering. So the whole network activity can go without any blocker in between. And for Azure Synapse Link, actually is not a big deal. You have to install this component, which is the host integration runtime, which is the one that you have to install it on the SQL Server, publish it through Azure, and then configure it in Azure Synapse Link, and then use the external link service in Azure to reach your SQL Server, and then you have to do the mapping of which tables you would like to have synchronized. This is not, I mean, for Azure Synapse Link, is not the same like an availability group. In availability group, you should synchronize the whole database, right? For Azure Synapse Link, you select which tables you want to synchronize or replicate, right? As for now, there are some restriction in some of the data types that you can synchronize. You cannot just select all your tables and synchronize them. There are some limitations, but you know, as the feature evolves and when we reach GA, definitely there's going to be more cases in where we will be able to do that. It's not complex, right? In the documentation, it's quite well explained. So, and again, you saw it in action. You do something on your SQL Server, and right away you see it in the tables.
Is it quite like always on availability group, right? Secondary node of it's work like a secondary node in availability group.
In managed instance, yes, it is exactly the same, but it's using the concept of distribute availability group, right? Because you cannot set up the window cluster, etc. So you need to set up the master key, you need to set up the endpoint, and few things that the wizard is helping you to do it really easily, right? The only thing that you have to do externally is what I said earlier, just configure the VNet peering in the VNet in where you have your managed instance and your SQL Server 2022, right? And also remember, as I said, you have to contact Microsoft because they need to give you the instructions on how to create the managed instance to make it aware for this feature, at least at this stage in preview, right? Basically, is to match the product level compatibility between SQL Server 2022 and managed instance. They have to put something in your subscription, and then it's quite transparent. By the way, you have to create a new managed instance. You cannot convert one of your existing one to be part of a distributed availability group today in the private preview, right? Then in the future that will change.
Thank you very much. It's a fantastic session, and we have learned many more things of upcoming SQL Server 2022.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Javier.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you, everybody. I will enjoy the rest of the event today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Much.
Congratulations.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.